Hello, everybody. Welcome to At America. My name is James, one of the e-guides here at America, and we welcome our audience members joining us online. We hope that you're doing well and staying safe. At America is the U.S. Embassy's American Center, and our mission is to provide a space for young Indonesians to learn more about the United States. In this episode, we'll be having presidential elections and popular opinions. But before we begin, I have a little icebreaker for everyone. I have here a question. How many electoral votes does a candidate need to be elected president? And I have here several options. A, 100, B, 270, B, 435, and D, 538. Stay tuned until the end of this program because we'll be giving a live shout out to whoever can answer correctly on our social media. Other than that, don't forget to take a selfie and tag at America's Instagram account. Now, before I introduce our moderator for today, I'd like to introduce Pak Leo Jilk from the U.S. Embassy Jakarta to give his opening remark. Pak Leo, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening to everyone in the audience. And it's my privilege today to welcome two experts to the stage at America for this conversation on the role of social movements in the U.S. presidential elections. I'll keep my remarks brief because our speaker, Gracia Hillman, and our moderator, Dahlia Umar, have a tremendous amount to say regarding the U.S. electoral process and how social issues and social movements affect political campaigns and the results of U.S. presidential elections. However, before we begin, I do want to emphasize that this discussion on social movements is not just a discussion about politics. It's a discussion about the core values and the fundamental rights that citizens of the United States and citizens of Indonesia share, especially freedom of expression and the right to vote in free and fair elections. The American journalist Walter Lippmann said, "Social movements are at once the symptoms and the instruments of progress. Ignore them, and statesmanship is irrelevant. Fail to use them, and it is weak." To me, that means that in democratic societies like ours, it's the public. It is we, the people, who decide whether our needs have been ignored or heard by our leaders, and whether our demands have been taken seriously, or if our trust has been abused. And how do we voice our satisfaction or dissatisfaction with our government? Through the freedom and the right to vote. And it's for this reason that the United States has amended its constitution several times to make our system more inclusive and more democratic for all citizens. And with that said, I wanted to note that I believe that our speaker and our moderator as well not only are experts in this field, but they also exemplify efforts to make the systems, the electoral systems in our societies more inclusive and more democratic citizens. For example, Gracia Hillman has led many nonpartisan and bipartisan efforts to ensure open access to voting process for all citizens, especially focusing on the rights of women and minority Americans. She worked on the historic 25-year extension of the National Voting Rights Act in the United States. Dahlia Umar, our moderator, is the chairperson for the Network for Indonesian Democratic Society. She also is an advocate for democracy, free and fair elections, as well as discussions like this and publications and training for election commissioners, observers, and other advocates for democracy. And I think that's crucial to our discussion tonight. I'm also proud to say exchange program, the International Visitor Leader, and I look forward to enjoying this discussion with you.
All right, now without further ado, let me introduce everyone to today's moderator, Bu Dahlia Umar, the chairperson for Indonesian Democratic Society. All right, Bu Dahlia, the stage is yours.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Pak Leo. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar organized by America. My name is Dahlia Umar from Network for Indonesian Democratic Society. I hope everyone is in good shape in this difficult time. It is my honor to be the chair to moderate this session, which entitled Political Opinion in the U.S. Presidential Election. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this webinar is broadcasted in all social media of America and American Corner University of Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta Facebook. Participants may share their comments and questions in our social media during this discussion, and we will try our best to have our speaker to respond to your questions and comments in the Q&A sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, in a few weeks, the U.S. citizen will determine their democracy by voting for presidential elections. There has been policies, events, incidents that shape the USA political landscape nowadays. Issues on identity, discrimination, civil and voting rights have been a major concern in the recent political debates. It also raised many political movements and social movements such as Black Lives Matter, Black Voters Matter, and counter movements. How the social movement is responded by the president candidate, and to what extent this movement affect people engagement and support to their candidates, and at the end might affect to American decision on the voting day. We are very distinguished to talk about this topic with our speaker. I would like to read a little bit of her bio here. Our speaker today is Ms. Gracia Hillman. She is a long-term advocate on minority rights and has extensive knowledge and experience in election administration and advocating voters' participation. She is the president, CEO, and principal consultant at GM Hillman and Associates. She is a former president for external affairs at Howard University and served as commissioner on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission from 2003 to 2010 and other prestigious posts. Without further ado, we would like to have Ms. Gracia to deliver her presentation for 15 minutes and then followed by further discussion in the Q&A questions. There will be 3 terms for this in this seminar. To Ms. Gracia, the time and the screen is all yours, please.
Thank you very much. Hello, Indonesia. I am so pleased to be with you today. It's quite exciting, and I really appreciate the interest in the participation in the presidential elections here in the United States. I remind my friends and colleagues that the world is watching what we are doing here, and indeed, all Americans should be watching what we're doing. This is a very difficult time around the world, and it is equally as difficult here in the United States. People have many opinions about what should be going on and what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. And a level of intolerance for different opinions has evolved to the point where there are very difficult times. People can't hear each other anymore. Sometimes people can't even take yes for an answer when yes is the answer they want because they're suspicious of who is telling them the information. I want to thank Embassy Jakarta and America for this kind invitation, and I look forward to our discussions, Dahlia. I'm sure it will be, I hope it will be very informative for all the participants. Throughout my career, and certainly probably beginning in high school, I have been involved in projects and activities and organizations that furthered community involvement, citizen participation, civic engagement. But even in the early years, I didn't necessarily know what that meant. I just knew that intuitively, to me, it felt natural. It was something that interested me and something that I grew to enjoy. I was most fortunate to be able to have employment throughout my career where it always touched some form of citizen engagement, whether domestically in the United States and even the opportunities when I had to work globally through the World Space Foundation, principally in Africa and to a lesser degree in India. I thought I would begin by saying two things. One is there is a lot of information, more information than we could possibly cover in the next hour or so. So I will try to hit key points and keep the discussion on a higher level so we don't get distracted by details, because some of the details, as I'm sure people appreciate, can be very confusing. Secondly, I will try to pick up points along the way, and especially through the questions and answers. So I do look forward to the questions and answers. I thought we should begin with just an explanation and understanding of the basic foundation of voting in the United States. It's something that we used to learn about in school, and then not so much. Civic education sort of fell by the wayside, and students didn't learn the basics and the fundamentals in recent years the way they were taught in earlier years. And to some degree, you could say, why should voters have to know what the Constitution is, what it provides, what were the amendments, how were they factored into today's voting? And that's probably right. Voters can't be held responsible for knowing everything about everything. Just the basics of how are you eligible, where do I go to vote, and when do I go to vote. But let me begin with just a review of the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution is considered the supreme law of the United States, and it lays the foundation for its democracy, elections, and voter participation. And it provides that voting is a right and a privilege. So it's not a mandate. It's a right for people who are citizens of the United States. And it is considered a privilege, although many would say that the privilege is that you can choose to vote or not. And other people would argue that we absolutely should be voting and should not take the privilege for granted. There are several articles in the Constitution. Article 1 establishes, among other things, the manner of electing members of Congress, and that is the basis around which the presidential elections evolved. And when I say Congress, it's both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. Article 1 also provides the right for citizens to vote so that the officials are chosen by the people. Section 4 of Article 1 then goes on to say the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by that state's legislature. And that's the rub. We have 50 states and the District of Columbia, and each of those can have their own procedures for voting, their own requirements, set their own dates. The one date that always holds firm is that the presidential election is held on the Tuesday after the first Monday of November. So it's not always the first Tuesday of November. November begins on a Tuesday, then the election would be held the following week. I can't tell you why Tuesday after the first Monday, but somebody decided that made sense, so that's the way it is. Now, having said that, Congress may, at any time through law, alter regulations around the federal elections. Congress does not set the rules for how a state conducts its own elections for statewide office, for its own state legislatures, for campaigns or elections for mayor or lower levels of government. It's, you know, and there's a saying that one size does not fit all. And so states say, what works in California doesn't work in Idaho. What works in Idaho doesn't work in Louisiana. And so every state determines its own procedures. And the history in the United States, unfortunately, is that the southern states used that right to be able to prohibit African Americans from voting right up through the 60s until the first Voting Rights Act was passed. Several amendments to the Constitution then further elaborated on voting. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves. Theoretically, that meant former slaves as citizens could vote. And that was 1868. The 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibits the use of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, meaning slavery, in determining which citizens may vote. So there was a whole Reconstruction period around that time in which African Americans were voting, and in fact, several African American men were elected to the United States Congress. The 19th Amendment in 1920 prohibits the government from denying women the right to vote on the same terms as men. Now, there was a whole struggle that went on. Congress didn't just one day decide, oh, this would be the right thing to do. Women had to fight and work really hard to gain the right to vote and to get the Constitution amended so that that right would be guaranteed in the Constitution. And women were jailed, they marched, they protested, not unlike what we've seen in other situations. You know, the pain was worth it. Women then began to also find themselves running for elective office and beginning to be accepted into the men's club to serve on legislative bodies. So during this time, going back to 1868, 1870, as states were beginning to find ways to exclude people, theoretically, legally exclude people from voting, there was a poll tax, meaning that, you know, there were conditions that you had to prove in order to be able to vote. And so in 1964, there was the 24th Amendment, which prohibited a poll tax for voting. If we're having free and fair elections, paying a poll tax is not one. You may have heard stories in some of your reading about Black people being asked to count the number of stones in a jar or how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap. Ridiculous things like that that would prohibit people from exercising their legal right to vote. And then we come up to the 26th Amendment in 1971, which expanded the right to vote to citizens 18 years and older. Before that, the legal age was 21. Now, the 26th Amendment evolved after lots of student protests against the Vietnam War and the insistence that if you could be drafted into service to serve in the military and go to war and risk life on behalf of your country, you should be able to vote in the processes of the country. So that sets the stage for people to understand there are fundamentals that states don't just make up how it is that voting proceeds. Nonetheless, after 2000, when the presidential election results ended up at the Supreme Court when President Bush was running against former Vice President Al Gore. Congress realized that there were some things that did need attention and correction in voting. And it passed a law, not an amendment to the Constitution, but a law called the Help America Vote Act. It left in place that states would continue to prescribe the time, place, and manner of holding elections, but it also did regulate certain things. And one of the big things that came out of the Help America Vote Act was access to the polls, access for people with disabilities, physical disabilities, and other disabilities, people who could vote and should be voting, but because of physical barriers, steps, small doorways, and other things, or the way the voting machines were designed, that prevented them from voting. So as you get through that, and then when you get down to the role of elections in democracy, the rule for democracy is that it's ruled by the people through free and fair elections. Well, what does that mean? Well, up comes the Electoral College, and it can be very, very confusing. And it was interesting that the opening question was about the Electoral College. So I don't want to, I don't want this to be a spoiler alert, but all I will say, and we can get into more of the details later, is that the Electoral College is determined state by state according to the number of congressional districts in each state, plus the 2 senators. So when you look at a small state like Delaware, which is the home state for Mr. Biden, or if you look at the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., which is a small jurisdiction that does participate in the Electoral College, they only have 1 Electoral College plus 2 for the 2 senators, although Washington doesn't have any senators in Congress. So they each get 3 electoral votes. That is something most people don't think about. Even when people say, what do you mean he got more votes or she got more votes than the other candidate, but still wins because they got more electoral college votes? How does that work? Well, it breaks down into how many votes were cast and what the majority of those votes were in each congressional district. And that sort of determines what those outcomes are. It's science and math, but it also is part of the political process, because the congressional districts are determined by the census, and state legislatures draw the maps within their state that determine what the makeup of each congressional district would be. And that then is the basis from which the Electoral College vote comes from. And so while people don't fully appreciate the importance of participating in the census, participating in the census is so important because it determines the size of the population in a state, so that it will determine how many members of Congress that state will have. And it also determines the portion of federal assistance and federal funding that the state would be eligible for. And the census happens every 10 years. And so if people, it's closed for 2020. If people did not participate in the census this year, then they won't be able to do that again until 2030. And so decisions that will be made for the next 10 years are going to be based on the numbers this year. Well, with the pandemic and a lot of things closed and people staying home and not working, there was concern about whether or not most people would participate in the census because of the ability, if you don't have access to the internet, then you can't register online. Libraries were closed, so people couldn't go to the library to participate in the census. Door-to-door canvassing did not happen in a lot of places because of the lack of volunteers, but also because of concerns about safety under the pandemic. So, that then brings you back to the size of the Electoral College. When we vote for president on the ballot, underneath the names of the president and the vice presidential candidates are the names of several people who are the electors. And that's just, another part of the political process. People who want to be involved and want to be considered the electors, the people who actually go and cast the vote on behalf of the population of the state, are actually elected at the same time that the voter chooses the president or the vice president. There is direct election for members of Congress, however. So everybody who serves in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate are directly elected and win by majority vote. And the states determine what happens with governors, attorneys general, secretaries of state, other people who hold a statewide elected office. Most of those states do have direct election, although some of those important positions are elected positions, and either the legislature or the governor appoints to that position. And then we get into restricting the right to vote, disenfranchisement. What happens with disenfranchisement? I think what I'll do is stop here and see if there are some questions at this point in the presentation that I should address before we go on to the next. Dahlia, are there any questions?
Sorry. I would like to raise an issue about, you mentioned that states regulate their own elections law, also related to voter registrations law. But is there any chance that states made laws like voter ID laws that has been introduced in several states since 2013, I think, that may challenge the voters of becoming unregistered? For instance, the mandatory of voters to have voter ID, a specific voter ID, whilst actually it should be comes from their ID, their tax ID or driver ID. But instead, several states introduce certain laws on voters ID. And sometimes there are voters who, from middle and lower class, who tend to move from rented house to another house. So they have to update their addresses. And there are times they said, when I was there in 2018, they said that they think they have updated their addresses, but then they are not registered, so they cannot vote. Do you think that the federal government should regulate the basic minimum prerequisite into introducing the voter laws? Or do you think it is okay if the states independently rule the voters ID laws? The state legislature.
That's a good question, and it's one that's very controversial. The federal government will continue to defer to the states that they should establish the voter registration laws, what's required, because they have been asked to assume the responsibility for carrying out the elections for president and Congress and the Senate. It is absolutely true that some of the very restrictive voter registration laws have made it difficult for certain populations of people to register and vote. And that is not by accident. At the end of the day, when you look at everything that is going on with respect to changes in voter registration laws and procedures, it is about controlling the outcome as to who will be able to vote in a particular election. Now, I don't want to suggest that states do this on purpose or intentionally, but when you analyze something like what is required when you go to register to vote, what you have to present when you go to vote. If I have a voter registration card, when you register to vote, you usually get a card that says you're registered to vote and it has your name and other identifying information, but not any personally identifying information. If I have that card and another form of ID, should that not be sufficient? The requirement that it has to be a government issued ID, a driver's license, or some other government issued ID, a non-driver's voter ID, then that gets to be difficult and it impacts populations that wouldn't necessarily have to have those things. Now, some people believe, well, everywhere you go, you need identification. If you used to be, if you used your credit card, you had to show ID. Well, that went away. We don't do that anymore. And so maybe for certain parts of the population, yeah, I'm used to having to show my ID. If I go into a federal building, I have to show ID in order to get into the building. But that excludes a lot of populations. We have to be mindful that there are a lot of people who don't have the ID. Indicating where you go to register to vote is also another restrictive form. Being able to register online is quite convenient, and many, many people use it. But we are also remembering that there are large sections of the United States where people do not have easy access to the internet, where perhaps they cannot afford to pay to have the internet brought into their home, where they would have to go to the public library or some other place to be able to access the internet. And then there's the concern about using a computer in a public place where you're entering sensitive information, your social security number, your driver's license number, your address, your date of birth, because people know that computers in public places can be hacked or the information can be taken back out. So you are right that it would simplify things if the federal government would set a minimum standard. Now, the states that are very lenient on voter registration, when I say lenient, that they don't have those same requirements. You show up the day of the election and register to vote and vote on the same day, would not want to have to do a more restrictive practice. So that would also bring in another perspective on what happens if the federal government sets the standard for what will be required for people to register and vote. So it's an important discussion. It's one that Congress has had. Secretaries of state in their membership, in their association meetings have had these discussions. And we don't seem to be any closer to that now than we were 10 years ago.
Another question also, the challenges in mail voting that has been raised, the voters, they opt for mail voting are increasing now in the USA as the impact of the pandemic. Do you think it is secure enough to ensure the right of voting for people? Because there are news that says there are people who haven't received the ballots, and then when they went to the voter registration offices, it was a long queue, and it is not easy for them to get the ballots easily, and sometimes it takes hours and days, and then they went home. And I think this system should also a concern that not only it's about the voter registrations issue, it's also about the election system and the voting system itself that affects to the integrity of the election, where people some cannot vote because of these irregularities. What do you think about the challenges in mail voting this week?
I read an article that wasn't about voting by mail, but it happened to include information that said the first mail-in ballots in the United States were done around the time of the Civil War. Now, I couldn't verify that, but it would make sense that people who were serving in the army, or, well, because it would have been mostly men voting at that time, or people who lived in very rural areas and depended on the mail delivery, which came by stagecoach or somebody riding a horse, would want to be able to vote by mail because it was difficult to get to wherever it would be that they would go to vote. Voting by mail has not been as widely discussed in previous years as we are doing this year. There's a lot of noise and a lot of chatter, and unfortunately, a lot of misinformation as to what is happening. There's a lot of distrust, which is really too bad because that's sort of the basis of a lot of the problems we're going through right now. Voters don't trust government entities to do the right thing by them being the voters. Some government entities don't trust the voters. I'm sure you all have heard many widespread accusations about voter fraud by mail, but for the most part, states and local jurisdictions, by local jurisdiction, I mean counties or cities or other places that are directly responsible for running elections, have good procedures in place for getting absentee ballots. Yes.
There are some questions raised by participants. The first is, I will read this question and then you will respond. There are two actually. The first one is from Priyagung Arif. I would like to ask regarding to the first presidential debate before the election, is there any correlation within the result of the debate and the electability of each candidate, especially in the swing states? Because according to my understanding, the debate usually really affect the electability of candidates. Like for example, here in Indonesia, it is the same. Is it the same in the US, or is there any explanation for that? And another question from Ramazan by Ram Sofiano. If the Senate appointed ACB to the SC, therefore there will be more conservative judge. I think it is referred to Connie Barrett to the Supreme Courts. Therefore, there will be more conservative judge. So, is there any possibility that the Supreme Court will favor Trump if the election results are sued to the Supreme Courts? These two questions from the audience.
Okay, on the issue of the importance of the debate on helping people make their decision about which candidate they will vote for, many people do wait for the debates to see how the candidates perform and what they discuss. But this year, hundreds of thousands of people have already voted even before the debates began. So I think that the debates are informative and useful, but by the time of the debates, most people have made up their minds. This year's been very different because there haven't been the in-person rallies and conferences, and you couldn't, go to like the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention the way people would in the past. And so people made up their minds early based on information before the debates. But the debates do have some impact. Tonight, actually, tonight, my time, will be the last presidential debate before the election. But I think, quite frankly, and many of the political analysts have said most people have made up their minds by now. With respect to the appointment to the Supreme Court, I mean, I certainly can't, and I think many people can only speculate what the new justice, assuming she is confirmed, what the new justice would do. But unfortunately, we do have a precedent where the results of a presidential election had to be determined in the Supreme Court. And it really came down to, you know, how the election law is applied to the counting of the ballots. There are many different, even again, state by state, if the vote is within a certain percentage point, it automatically requires a recount. A candidate can request a recount if there isn't an automatic recount, and that takes a certain number of days. But generally speaking, the candidate has to pay for that. So there are many different factors that would determine whether or not the outcome of this presidential election ends up before the Supreme Court. And it would really come down to it being a very close election. That would be determining whether the state results are called into question, and it can only be resolved at the Supreme Court level. I personally think it is most unfortunate that we get to a point where presidential elections in the United States, people casually say, well, we'll let the Supreme Court decide that. Well, that's not why the Supreme Court was set up. It was not set up to decide presidential elections. Presidential elections were set up for the people, for the population to vote, for the states to administer free and fair elections and good administrative practices, so that there couldn't be questions about the results of the votes.
All right, Gracia, you can start to have a second presentations on the second topic.
Okay, what I want to talk about a little bit is, when we've talked about the disenfranchisement, the things that can happen that can prevent people from voting, even if unintentional. You know, election administrators are responsible for knowing what needs to be in place so that all eligible voters will be able to participate should they choose. Some jurisdictions establish their budgets based on previous voter participation rates. So if only 50% of eligible voters vote, then for 2 years, 2 elections in a row, then that's how they determine their budget. Well, then if you get into a cycle like this one, where there's very high voter participation rate, it's going to cost more money. And many jurisdictions find they don't have the money. Add to that complication what it's costing the states to manage the corona pandemic, and it just gets to be about money in many cases. Can the election jurisdictions afford to do the necessary things that will make voter participation possible? And that's why you see on television the very long lines. People are determined if they have to stand in line until November 3rd, they are going to be there and they are going to be able to vote. The other population that is disenfranchised in many states are people who either are currently in prison or who have previously been in prison. Some states take away the right to vote for people when they're sentenced to prison. Some states restore it when you come out of prison, when you're off probation, and some states don't. So there are a lot of lawsuits and policy discussions going on now about those two things. What I'd like to do is talk about what happens in the election cycle between now and November 3rd. Basically, what happens is people go to vote. And that's what's happening now. And come November 3rd, after November 3rd, the preliminary results will be reported out. By preliminary results, I mean what the numbers were. Now, if a jurisdiction realizes it has more absentee ballots than the difference between the two voters. And I'll just use some hypothetical numbers. 20,000 people voted. One candidate got 9,500 votes. The other candidate got 9,600 votes. And yet there are 5,000 absentee ballots to be counted. Those ballots have to be counted because the number of mail-in ballots exceeds the difference between the totals that the two candidates received. In some places, if one candidate has 18,000 votes and the other has 2,000, and there are only 1,000 absentee ballot, mail-in ballots, then they will call the election because even when they count all the absentee ballots, it's not going to change the outcome. And that usually happens the same night or the next day or within 2 or 3 days. This year, it's likely to take longer for two reasons. Election officials are going to be very careful to make sure that they get the counting right, and there will be a lot of absentee ballots to be counted. And the counting of the ballots depends on how they count the ballots and how many ballots there are to be counted. And according to state law, the elections have to be certified generally within 30 days. So if we go to the PowerPoint presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about influences on the presidential election. And the first chart we see, and I'm using information from the United States Census Bureau. Earlier, I discussed how important the census count is in determining many things around the presidential election. And the Census Bureau for many, many years has been collecting data about voter participation. So what we see here, since 1980 to the 2016 election, what the rates of participation are. And we see that the group that has almost consistently had the highest rate of participation are people ages 65 and older. And that's been a given. And that's where voting by mail has become so important because many seniors have been advised to reduce the amount of time they spend in large crowds. And so the preference is to vote absentee rather than show up at a polling place. The next age group would be 45 to 64. And what we can see on the chart is that they had the highest rate of participation from 1980 until about 1992, and then it started dropping off. The next group, 30 to 44, there was a spike in 1992 participation, and then it dropped significantly, and it stayed around 60%. And then the lowest levels of participation are among the younger voters, although we see that their participation showed a trend to go up between 2012 and 2016. It will be very interesting to see what this chart shows after the 2020 elections. I'm going to guess that the age groups, all age groups will show an increase, and probably the biggest increases will be in the groups 18 to 44. We can't know that for sure, but that seems to be the trend. Then on the next slide, we're looking at the voting rates broken out by race. And we can see where there have been differences in participation. Most notably, the significant increase in voter participation for Black Americans from 1996 through 2012. We can say for sure that in 2008 and 2012, the candidacy of President Obama had a lot of influence on that. And then we see the significant drop off in 2016. And I think this year, the reason why we see so many Black people turning out to vote, with so much emphasis on Black voter participation, is that they realize their participation makes a difference. Voters want to know that their participation makes a difference. And when it doesn't make a difference, people either get discouraged or they double down and say, no, I will not be counted out. And then we see below the rates for Hispanic voters, which also dropped in time. In the 1992-96 era, there was fairly low voter participation, but it seems to have leveled off between 2004 and 2016. And so that is instructive and informative. And again, it will be interesting to see what the Census Bureau reports those have been. On the next slide, we will be looking at voter participation rates, men and women. And you will see that women have out-registered and turned out in more numbers than men consistently over the years. And that many people will say that's not surprising. It's been useful and informative. And even when men had a drop in their turnout rates in the 1996 election, women did not have the same significant drop. So that's important for people to understand. Now, the next slide I want to talk about, and it gets to influences on voters. What influences voters? Where do they get their information? Who contacts them? What makes them make up their minds? So there are two big influences, and then I'll get into some of the more retail influences. One big influence is, what are NGOs, what are nonprofits saying about the many issues that they want the president and the United States Congress to pay attention to? And we have a lot of nonprofit organizations in the United States. Even the ones that provide direct services like housing and food programs and healthcare and others, many of them have issues that they advocate for. And by advocate, it means contacting their local or state or federal elected officials to ask them to put in place policies and laws that will protect certain segments of our community. By example, the largest, as best I could research, the largest nonprofit organization in the United States is what's now called AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. It has 38 million members. You must be age 50 or older to join. It has many benefits for its members, but it also has a very large government affairs, advocacy, and engagement department, meaning it stays busy to make sure that federal and state laws protect the rights of senior citizens and retired persons in the United States. The next presentation will be through a website link that will show a map. I'm sorry, I forgot about this one. So when we think about the nonprofit sector, what you can see is that there are 1.6 million nonprofits in the United States, more or less, and that Americans donate $390 billion to these nonprofits. A lot of that money does go onto advocacy programs. And so people depend on the nonprofits to do the hard work, to follow the detailed information that I, as an individual voter, couldn't possibly know. I can't keep up with everything, so I depend on organizations to do some of that work for me. Then it looks at 63 million people volunteer through these, and a lot of these are, in fact, door-to-door canvassing, passing out information, encouraging people to register to vote, helping people register to vote. So that just gives a sense of the influence of the nonprofit sector on how people receive their information and what information they receive. Then if we go to the map, the link for the map. This map comes from the United States Federal Election Commission. Everybody who contributes to a federal candidate for president, for Congress, for the United States Senate, has to register that donation with the Federal Election Commission. So this is nationwide for all candidates for president. I'm not showing Congress and I'm not showing the Senate here, but for the president in 2020. And what we see is that $3.5 billion was raised by all candidates. Then as we go down the list, you'll see how much was raised by Democrats, Democratic candidates, Democrats who were running, and by the Republicans. And then each individual candidate. And you'll see that Mr. Bloomberg raised the most money, followed by Mr. Biden, and it goes on down the list. When we scroll through this list, you will see just how many people across the country were running for the position of President of the United States. So it's quite a process. People have, at this point, election fatigue. They've heard so much information, but thank goodness Americans are not giving up and are continuing to participate by voting. When we look at the map, I will just pick out a few states so that the viewers can see where the money comes from. Money is a big influence. Money influences the candidates, and where that money comes from influences the candidates. So whether the money is from individual donors or political action committees, it has a big influence. We look at California, and that is the state where Senator Kamala Harris is from. You will see that almost 239, let's see, that would be $1 million, was contributed to all candidates for president from California. Texas is another big state, and there's a fair amount of money in Texas, but not nearly as much as what was contributed in California. We can speculate about what that was, but we have to guess that Senator Harris's candidacy had a big influence on that. I have to admit that I do not know if President Trump considers Florida or New York State his home base. But if you look at Florida, you look at the amount of money that people and entities in Florida contributed to the presidential election. And many times people do it because they have an interest in a candidate or candidates who are running, and they want those candidates to have money. And then if we go up to Delaware, it's a teeny tiny little state, but there it is. And this is Mr. Biden's state. And for a small state, that's a fair amount of money that has been raised, about $5.5 million. And then if we go up to New York, which is a big state with a lot of people who have influence and money, we can see the amount of money raised there. So I just show that to say that there are institutionally, there are two big factors. One is the nonprofit sector, and the other is the sector that generates the funding that candidates receive. In addition to those larger influences, voters receive their information through candidate speeches, and candidates have surrogates. Candidates can't be everywhere, so they have people who speak on their behalf. We address the influence of debates. Campaign literature. I mean, my mailbox has been filled the past 2 weeks with campaign literature, and I voted by absentee ballot. But because my ballot won't be counted until closer to the time of election, I'm still getting all of the mailings that the candidates are doing. endorsements. You want to know who your mayor endorsed or who some influential person in your community or at your job endorsed. People pay attention to that. Robocalls, those are those automatic calls. You know, a number shows up, you answer the phone, and there's somebody with a recorded message encouraging you to vote for somebody or for this particular issue. Canvassing, that's community-wide, door-to-door knocking. Not as much of that during the pandemic. A lot of canvassing has been done on the phone or by email. Donation solicitations, obviously people are asking for money, and candidates want to be able to show that they receive small dollar donations from lots of people rather than very large dollar donations from only a few people. When it comes to the efficiency of the elections, and we talked about, you know, whether absentee ballots received and processed accordingly, it really does come down to the commitment and competency of the people who are called election officials. They are responsible for administering the elections in their state, their town, their city. And these people could be elected, which always raises questions. If you're running the election and you're running for re-election, are you going to try to do things that are going to tilt it in your favor? And some of the election officials are appointed.
Gracia, there are 3 questions from the audience. Actually, there are many, but since we have only limited time, we have selected several questions from our YouTube account. First, from Kitten Sun Cats, her question is, what valid reason would a candidate have to request a recount? The second question is from Anton Junet. Are state electors allowed to vote against their state's popular votes? And the third question is from Rafif Setiawan. If Joe Biden win the next election, will his administration have the same way like Obama's? Those are the questions mostly related to the candidates and voting.
Okay, so I'm going to try to remember. The first question was about...
The first question about what valid reason would a candidate have to request a recount?
Right. Generally speaking,
and the other...
the recounts
yes,
are
go ahead.
When the vote counts are very close. 3% is used a lot to determine. So if my vote total is less than 3% difference from your vote total, I would request a recount because it's very possible that there was human error or something else that caused a miscounting in the ballots. Sometimes the totals change and sometimes they don't. But generally, candidates want to win, and so they're going to exercise every opportunity they have to make absolutely sure that they did not receive the majority of the vote. With respect to the Electoral College and the electors, again, state law varies, but generally speaking, the electors vote according to the results of the state. Now, there have been times when people have challenged and said, no, I'm not going to do that. I believe that more people in this state voted for candidate X than Y. But generally speaking, people respect, whether they like it or not, they respect the Electoral College process, even if it turns out to be what they would consider unfair to the popular vote in that state. And then the third question was, if you could remind me.
If Joe Biden is elected, is win the next elections, will his administration have the same way like Obama's administrations?
So Mr. Biden is his own person, and we very much saw his personality and influence when he served as vice president. But this is a very different time. Now, he will, again, if he is elected president, be inheriting a time when we've got all kinds of economic uncertainty and challenges. And I'm sure that things that he learned from what President Obama had to do when he went through correcting the economic challenges. I'm sure Mr. Biden would probably apply those lessons learned. But what I would say is that Mr. Biden is his own person, and he is inheriting a very different situation. Do we have other questions, or
It's you can stop for these sections. You can begin with the third presentation.
Okay. All right. So I will wrap up by talking about, in addition to money and the advocacy of nonprofit organizations and political action committees and political parties, what are the issues that are affecting the 2020 elections? And one other major source of information and influence are news reports and what comes from the media, both traditional and social. And that is helpful and not helpful at the same time. So I will refer, the term I use is traditional media, the established media that we know about and the information they're reporting. For me, it's different and it's changed. And it's not always very helpful because a lot of information is being packed in a few minutes of reporting. And it feels like what's being reported is what will grab the most attention. But the media does serve a very important purpose to provide information, and we trust and hope that it'll be unbiased. And when it is not unbiased, that the media source will make that very clear. What's less predictable is information and impact on social media. I mean, that is overwhelming. There are so many places somebody can get information. Or if somebody has your email address, how much unsolicited information gets dumped into your email box. But people have to be very, very careful. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Some of the misinformation is because people don't know the facts and they're just repeating what they heard from someplace else. But a lot of it is intentional to try to cause confusion. And they figure what better than to have people confused saying, you know what, I'm not going to bother because this isn't making any sense to me. I think voters are showing this year that they're not going to buy into that they will get the information that they feel they need, and they will make a decision based on what they're hearing from their trusted sources. So I always caution and advise, if you can't verify 3 times the information that you've seen from 3 different sources, at least 3 different sources you know and trust that have been around for a while, then to be very skeptical about the information. You know, running a presidential election during a global pandemic, you know, not in 100 years has the United States been through that, and it has impacted everything. And there will be, I'm sure, lots of reports and analyses after the election, try to figure out what impact the pandemic had on the results of the election. We cannot ignore the racial tensions. I mean, those are very real. And that is all about respect for humanity and just appreciating differences in people rather than wanting to isolate and not hear what other people have to say. But particularly young people in this country, African Americans, yes, but the people who know and work with and go to school with African Americans and who live in the same communities, and, you know, other groups, Latinx and Asian Americans, to a degree, Native Americans, are saying, we are tired of waiting. Do not tell me to wait anymore for the issues that make my life difficult to be resolved. And so, that is very much an influence on the elections. Policies around immigration, another big issue and a difficult one. And policies around healthcare. I mean, it is difficult for people to think that in the middle of this pandemic, and we don't know what the effects of COVID-19 are on the people who have contracted the virus and have, quote unquote, gotten better, and what long-term effects there will be. So we don't know what the long-term healthcare needs will be for people, and if insurance companies will have the audacity to say, pre-existing conditions will not be covered under your policy. So healthcare is a very, very big issue, and it's expensive to get the care that people need under regular circumstances, let alone under circumstances with a pandemic. And then there's the economy, there's the wealth gap. A lot of conversations about, even in this most difficult time, wealthy people are making a lot of money, and then low wage earners who have lost their jobs for the most part are having to live on what little bit of money they've either saved or could get through unemployment insurance, and don't know whether their job will be there. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. And many of the workers here are dependent on the restaurant and the hotel industry and clubs and bars. And they don't know whether their jobs will be there when they return. Many of the owners of those establishments, particularly the small community establishments, don't know if they can make it through this. And then, the influence of the stock market and investments. It's just interesting to see how the stock market has responded to this versus the economic conditions in communities. And those are all things that people are aware of, and they know is very much on their minds. And they want, when people turn out to vote in high numbers, it's because they're very enthusiastic about something, or they really want to see things. So I think with that, I will go back to your questions.
Okay. Gracia, there are some questions for this third part. There is one from Rafif Setiawan. There is one from James Stansil about the younger generations. The younger generations, with the younger generations being more involved in politics due to various reasons, would you be able to tell us if they are swinging more left or right within the political pendulum in the United States?
I think that's hard to know right now. What we see the most of are the younger voters. And when I say younger, I'm just going to say under age 40, just to make it simple. What we see most covered in the news are the activists, people who have been involved in or supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, or who have been supportive of issues that would close the economic gap, people who are concerned about climate change, and the things that the United States should be doing to minimize the impact on climate change and reduce the kind of violent weather patterns that we've been seeing. But when you look at the rallies and the various large group events for President Trump, there are a lot of people there under age 40. So without seeing the numbers, it's really, on the face of it, hard to tell. I would have to guess that, like 1971 or the 1969, 1970 era, when students were protesting against the Vietnam War, and that produced a larger group of voters supporting progressive candidates and candidates in the Democratic Party. I would have to guess that is what is happening now.
Okay, Gracia, you mentioned about there are many issues that may affect to the result of elections. There is healthcare issues, and then immigrations, and then the economic development during the pandemic, and then I want to know if whether Trump is seen has been successful in the dealing with the pandemic crisis, because in some cases when leaders are not very successful in overcoming crisis, they are not likely to be re-elected. Do you think this can be different in the USA because there are more factors on how the presidents can be re-elected or not re-elected?
So let me repeat to see if I understand the question. Is the question whether some of the prominent issues that the United States are facing and how those issues are currently being handled or are being handled by current elected officials will impact their ability to get reelected versus whether the process has more influence on how they get reelected? Is that the question?
Yes, it is. And
Okay.
also, yes, right, Gracia.
Okay, thank you. So absolutely, for any elected official, the way a difficult situation is being handled by that office, and let me explain what I mean. Whether you're a governor or a mayor or a member of a legislative body, the president of the United States, a member of the Senate, that very much will affect whether or not that person gets reelected, because the people who are most concerned about that, if they turn out to vote, and all indications are that people are voting in response to the things that are bothering them right now. And that would very much. I mean, there were members of the United States Senate, and we'll go back to an issue, and again, it was around the Supreme Court nominee. Some of you may be aware when Justice Clarence Thomas was being considered, had been nominated and was being considered by the US Senate to be appointed to the Supreme Court. There were some very difficult times during his confirmation hearing with issues concerning issues that were raised by Anita Hill. And some of the senators came across as tone deaf. And by that, I mean that they were not realizing how upset women were as to how it was being handled. And at least two of those senators lost their efforts for reelection, and before the Supreme Court hearing, that would not have happened. And it did also result in an African-American woman being elected to the United States Senate from the state of Illinois. But for a long time, people have liked their incumbent elected official because that person brings resources to the community and helps resolve issues. And even if that person takes positions on issues that aren't very favorable, you know, they'll look and say, well, for the most part, he or she really cares about the community. And yeah, we didn't like what they did on this or that issue, but we're willing to continue to work with them. So incumbency still is a big factor. But I think this year, a lot of incumbent elected officials are having to really campaign hard and work very hard and speak directly to the American people because the legislative bodies they belong to have done things that people don't appreciate right now. And is there another question?
I think we have technical difficulties with Dahlia.
Okay.
So for the meantime, I try to contact her.
All right. Well, I will go back to talking about,
She's back, ma'am.
okay, great. Thank you. Dahlia, is there another question or two?
Yes. I would like to to restore my computer first. I apologize for this. But you may continue to what you want to about to say before I try to reconnect with the questions.
Okay. What I was going to say is that many people think that voting is a thankless task, that people have to go through, not in every state, but in many states, people have to go through a lot of hoops to get registered to vote. And then they've got to pay attention as to where they vote and what time they vote. And, you know, some states require a match of your original signature. I don't know about you, but my signature is different almost week to week. It depends on what I'm signing, whether I'm sitting or standing or where I am. And so exact signature matches have disqualified some people from voting. And if the candidate or the issue that the voter cared a lot about doesn't win, doesn't prevail, and people get discouraged because everybody wants to win. And people don't want to feel like I am being discounted because somebody has political motivations. And that's a lot of what goes on with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements where people say, don't discount me as a human being just because you want something different. We're all in this together. So, you know, the groups who work on voter activities really have to work hard to encourage people to always vote, to hang in there, because that is the only way a person can get a job as a representative or a senator or a president or a governor. They have to be elected. And so it's like people participating in the hiring of that person to do that job. And then after that job is done, we go back to the role of the nonprofit and issue advocacy groups. They're the ones who have to be there to hold that person accountable on the things that need to be done and that the candidate said they would do. It's like any place else. I mean, everybody has a supervisor. Even if you're the chief executive officer, you have a board of directors that you're responsible to. And even privately held companies, you know, there's a board of directors. And even if you are the principal owner of the company and it's your money and you're almost the single shareholder, there is still an accountability factor. And that's what makes for good policy. That's what makes for good work product. And so the advocacy groups appreciate the support of the people who live in the communities, and support through membership or just support through receiving their information so that the elected officials are held accountable once they get the job.
Gracia, do you think the candidates, the presidents, the Congress, and the Senate candidates will take into account these movements and whether they take it into a very important stage towards the next elections, and whether they just listen to much more strategies of their political parties?
Well, I think the candidates certainly should. I would like to say they have to pay attention to what's going on. They certainly should. It's like driving down the street, and if there's there are huge potholes in the street, and you pretend you don't see them and you just drive through them, and then your car gets damaged and you kind of wonder what happened. Well, when there are signs, when there are visible signs of problems, it is a election official's responsibility to pay attention. So yes, I think that many are. Now, does that mean that they're going to make different decisions now than they will make after they get reelected? Or are they making different decisions now than they made a year ago? And are they doing that only to get reelected? Well, the people who live in those communities and the voters there are the ones who have to determine and decide that. And that's, for me, that's one of the beauties of voting. You can look and see, well, what did Gracia say last year on this issue? What is she saying right now? And are those two things consistent? Or if she's changed her position, is that really where she is, or is she only telling me this so that I will vote for her? And it happens. We know it happens.
Gracia, this is the end of our discussions. We would like to have a closing remark first from you, and then we will be closing this seminar.
All right. Well, thank you. And I want to say again how much I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this program, to be in Jakarta, to be in Indonesia right now. Appreciate the interest of all the people who are listening in, who have submitted questions. It is very important in the United States, as I've mentioned, for voters to hold their elected officials and their advocacy groups accountable, but it's also important for us to hold each other accountable, but for the world to hold the United States responsible for following through on what it says it's going to do. So it's nice to know that the people of Indonesia are interested in what is going on in our elections. This is a most unusual, certainly the first one in my years of voting, to be this, in one way I will say this uncertain, but there's a lot of emotion. Voters on all sides of the issues are very emotional about it. And when emotions drive decisions, it sometimes leads to surprising outcomes.
Thank you, Gracia. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now embarking to the end of these discussions. There are plenty of issues that we can discuss further, but we have to stop here. And thank you to Gracia for your excellent presentations. And we would like the audience to give Gracia virtual applause. And we thank to @America for having this event. And I hope everybody is staying well and healthy. And lastly, goodbye and have a good night and have a good day for everybody in the United States. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to our speakers and moderators for today's session. And I'm sure that a lot of our audience members watching from home really appreciate how helpful the information that Ibu Gracia has shared. Now, earlier in the event, we asked our audience members a question. How many electoral votes does a candidate need in order to be elected president? And the correct answer to that is 270. Unfortunately, no one was able to get the correct answer on our social media. But thank you to everyone who has participated. Don't forget to tune in next time to get another chance for a shout out from us. Now, you may be wondering, how could I develop an awesome idea for a place like this? That's easy. All you need to do is go to our website at www.atamerica.or.id, select Create a Program, and click Collaborate with us. All event proposals coming to us will be reviewed, and your event might be featured here soon. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for all our weekly updates. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. My name is James, and see you all next time at the next @America TV episode. Goodbye.